Well, I wish I was more like Kanye. I bet you weren't expecting me to say that this morning, did you? Not because he's a talented musician or because of his fame and his fortune. And no, I'm not condoning his behavior or much of anything when it comes to the way that he's lived his life. In fact, I'm not talking so much about who he is as I am what he's most recently experienced. Perhaps you've heard. You see, Kanye West, the famous Grammy-winning rapper, whom some of you better know as the husband to Kim Kardashian, recently had a conversion. Or as Kim has publicly declared it, he's become born again. And I'm not just talking about a quiet, epiphanal moment. No, I'm talking about a full-on Damascus Road experience. He went from writing a song entitled, "I Am God," to creating his most recent gospel album entitled, "Jesus is King." Rather than playing to sold-out arenas around the world, now he's performing at packed churches throughout the country. Recently he said to an audience, "I'm not here to entertain you this afternoon. I'm here to spread the gospel." Now don't get me wrong, I disagree with his promotion of the prosperity gospel and even the seeming self-promotion he does in expressing this newfound faith. But if he's telling the truth, Kanye West recently had a very profound, very personal experience with God. One that's changed his life. I don't want to be Kanye. I just want that kind of experience. Don't you? After all, he's not the only one. Moses encounters a burning bush. Isaiah has a vision in a dream. A couple of weeks ago, we heard the story of Peter, James, and John watching Jesus be transfigured before their very eyes. And they aren't just Bible stories. I mean, take Billy Sunday, for example, the famous professional baseball player turned evangelist, who walked out of a Chicago bar one Sunday afternoon and said to his teammates, "That's it, I'm through, I'm going to Jesus." And the church father Augustine, who, while overhearing a child's game in which one of the participants cried out the words, "Pick it up, read it," flung his Bible open to the passage that changed his life forever. And yes, even to the most unlikely of characters, someone like Kanye, who one day wasn't sure if he believed in God, and the next was more certain about that than anything else in his life before. I yearn for such an experience, but have yet to have one, and I suspect I'm not alone. I mean, don't you desire a mountaintop moment you can't explain? Don't you want a monumental minute that doesn't fit into your theological point of view? Don't you crave a divine event to which you can point that clearly changes your life? Well, I'm not sure if that's how Nicodemus would describe his encounter with Jesus, but it's clear from our reading today that at the very least, this was a moment that would have touched the right side of his brain more so than the left. Or at least that seems to be the case given Nicodemus' questions. He, like so many of us, comes from the school of rationale, where meaning is made from making arguments and measuring outcomes and justifying evidence. He's a religious leader, after all. He wants to know the answers. And so he comes to Jesus by night, which is when religious leaders were to be studying the Scriptures. Instead of studying Torah, however, he comes to Jesus to study Jesus. And Jesus says, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. What is born of the flesh is flesh. What's born of the Spirit is spirit. Nicodemus' right brain is fully engaged at this point, but his left is still desperately trying to make sense of it. How can anyone be born after having grown old, he asks. Can one enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born? Jesus responds, "The wind blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know from where it comes or where it goes. So it is with those who are born of the Spirit." It's no wonder Jesus' final words in this passage are in the form of a question. How can these things be? After an exchange like that, one can't help but end up with more questions than answers, which I suspect is the reason the church has turned this passage into a kind of mathematical equation, if you will. I mean, it's easier to write a systematic theology that includes boxes to be checked than to keep trying to live into the mystery of what it is to be born of the Spirit. And so in some instances, we've turned Jesus' words, "born from above," into the words, "born again." And in others deem that baptism by immersion in a specific tradition is the only way it's effective. And in other cases, hang all of Christianity on one verse, John 3:16, taken out of context, mind you, proclaiming that accepting Jesus into your heart in a specific time and place earns your salvation. Check, check, check. It's just that if you're truly from somewhere, well, you know it's just not quite that simple. Take where you're born from, for instance. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, but you better not call me a Buckeye. No, I'm most certainly a Hoosier. And not just because I grew up in Indiana, but because I was shaped by my experiences there. The culture, my family, my friendships, my education, my trials and errors, all the mess I made of life in between. They all in part formed who I am today. I was born in Ohio, but I'm most certainly from Indiana, which I think is what Jesus is attempting to get at with Nicodemus here. He doesn't say Nicodemus has to be born again in a particular place and time, but that he and all of us, for that matter, be born from above in every place and time. Like the wind, it blows where it chooses, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from and where it goes. You just know it's always there, constantly, continually weaving its way through your life. Of course, the only problem with this is that, well, that kind of life is a lot harder to live. It's easier to have all the answers than it is questions. It's easier for salvation to be about a one-time experience than a lifelong journey. It's easier to point to one day only in the past than to live into the mystery of the future. And you know what I mean. Like retreating to that relationship that's no good for you, but it's better than being alone. Or returning to that resentment and bitterness because it's harder to acknowledge and move through the grief you feel. Or reaching back to the food or the alcohol, the shopping or the online gambling or whatever it is that you focus on, anything than that which you really need to deal and address in order to move on and live again. You see, being born from above is a process. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we fail. Sometimes we even have a hard time of starting over and resetting and shutting it down altogether in order to reboot and try to live again. I can remember it was in 7th grade that I was trying out for the school talent show by singing the well-known song at the time, "Please Forgive Me" by Bryan Adams. I have no idea why I confess these things to you from the pulpit, by the way. Anyway, there I am, trying out on the stage, spotlight on, music starts. I get about a quarter of the way through the song when all of a sudden I completely forget the words. I go blank. So right in the middle of this tryout, I stop and I say, "Can we rewind the tape and start again?" That's right, it was a tape, a single tape for those of you who grew up in the 90s. And so I started over. And the second time through must have worked because I made it into the show. Quite frankly, I didn't just make it. The night of my actual performance, I kind of killed it. Perhaps not in the same way. But you know the value of this being able to start over. Like the child learning to write, being able to make a mistake, erase it, and then start again. Or the dad building the playset for his kids, putting a piece on backwards, and rather than just trying to patch the mistake, making it worse, goes back and starts from the beginning. Or the choreographer, her dancers get it wrong, stopping the rehearsal and saying, again, from the top. Being born from above is not necessarily about one specific instance, although that might be where it starts. Rather, it's more about being reborn over and over again throughout life as we become the people God calls us to be. It's not just about one moment in time, but many moments, each of which we learn from and grow as we seek to follow Jesus more faithfully. And each of those moments, however big or small, might be an opportunity to pause and reflect and reset, and yes, even change our lives, or even more, the life of another. Or at least that was the case for Olympic runner Nikki Hamlin a few years ago. While running the 5,000-meter race during the Olympics in Rio, she had to briefly slow down for a moment to try and pass another runner. When she did, Olympic runner Abby D'Agostino collided with her, and both runners went to the ground. As Hamlin got up to continue the race, she noticed D'Agostino behind her was injured. Instead of trying to catch up and at least finish in a position that would get her to the next round, she went back. She helped D'Agostino up, and with one arm over her shoulder, walked with her across the finish line. The two had never met one another before that day. Hamlin had trained 4 years for that race. But instead of trudging forward for herself, she stopped, she reset. And isn't that the way anyone or anything gets reborn? That marriage on the rocks, that relationship between a father and a son, even your relationship with God. Sometimes we have to pause and go back and reset before we can move forward again. Of course, the church has a name for this. We call it grace. I've thought about that word a lot here recently, especially over the course of these last few weeks as we've endured the challenges we've experienced with our church building. It's been a Lenten journey, unlike one I've had before. Is there any wilderness like going into a porta potty? I mean, just think about it. We had just passed a new visioning plan in December, made the official proclamation of becoming open and affirming, making tremendous progress with the day school, strengthening our partnership, creating great momentum and excitement and energy into a new year, when all of a sudden the sound goes out. And one morning we walk into 2 inches of water downstairs that has put almost everything on hold now for the last month. And just about the time we think we're going to get the water running in the building again, and the sounds of children will be back in our hallways downstairs, and programs will continue without worry in our building, and worship attendance will return to where it was, and we could finally get rid of those godforsaken porta potties, we hit another snag or stop dead in our tracks and have to reset in order to figure out how to trudge forward. And yet, because of those challenges, there have been moments for reflection. Like more than one pause for gratitude that we live in a country where clean water is readily available and indoor plumbing is the norm. And more than one moment to eat lunch with staff and volunteers that we might not normally have, to laugh about our shared circumstances rather than to be angry about them. And many pauses of appreciation for the love and the passion that people have for Sandy Springs Christian Church and the day school, who are pouring their time and their energy and their resources and their hearts into getting things back up and running again. Perhaps these are all more like moments of grace. While we may want a born-again experience, turns out what we need is the God John describes in our reading this morning, at least if you read it all the way to the end. A God who so loves the world that God would send God's Son, not to condemn the world, but to save us from ourselves over and over again. Or at least those of us who think we have a birthright to anything else but that with which we've already been so incredibly blessed.